So stage 2. Okay, so the next stage is that the glucose molecule is further broken down into a molecule called pyruvate. And the way that it's broken down by this process here called glycolysis. And I'll say more about that a little later. And at this point, glycerol joins in as well. So they're sort of running on a parallel track now. So the 6-carbon glucose molecule is reduced down to 2 3-carbon units called pyruvate. So if you think back to the equation of life that we looked at the start, the equation said C6. So the 6 refers to how many units there are of something. So we've got 6 carbons in our glucose molecule. So essentially we're going to divide that in half. And we're going to divide it in half, and what we end up with is something called pyruvate. And then the glycerol that comes from our fat is also converted to pyruvate. And this happens in the cytoplasm, or it's sometimes called the cytosol, which is like this sort of watery area that you have in your cell. And as a result of that, we've generated pyruvate, and then depending on how much oxygen we've got in our body, it can either go off somewhere where there's very little oxygen, or it can go off somewhere where there's lots of oxygen. So it's more beneficial for us if it goes through the process that has the oxygen in it, because we can produce more energy from that. So the next stage, so if we think about what happens if we have oxygen, which is generally most of the time because we don't go around holding our breath or deliberately not breathing, we have oxygen in our body. So then we convert the pyruvate that's come from the glycerol and the glucose molecule into something called acetyl-CoA. And the fatty acids that we broke off our fat in stage 1 are also converted by another process called beta oxidation into acetyl-CoA. So the whole thing joins together, so our fats and our carbs ultimately make acetyl-CoA. And the way that they make acetyl-CoA is that another enzyme comes along, but this is a coenzyme. It's called coenzyme A, and it joins onto a pyruvate molecule and it makes acetyl-CoA. And then the fatty acids are broken down by a process called beta oxidation into acetyl-CoA. And this takes place in the mitochondria, which is what this image is showing here. So this is a mitochondria cell. And as a result of that, the glucose and the fat that we've eaten have been broken down and have ultimately been broken down into a molecule called acetyl-CoA, and this now goes into something called the Krebs cycle. And in the Krebs cycle, we break the acetyl-CoA down again. And as a result of this breakdown, we generate carbon dioxide, which we breathe out as a waste product, and some energy is generated. So what happens is that the acetyl-CoA joins the Krebs cycle. It's called the Krebs cycle because it's basically a cyclical or circular reaction. It just goes round and round and round and round. So it's like a water wheel at a mill. It just keeps picking up acetyl-CoA that we get from our food, and it just keeps sending it round and round the system. And as it goes round and round the system, we change it and we break things off it and we add things to it. And ultimately what we produce are these two things here called NADH and FADH2. And in those two molecules, we've got electrons and hydrogen ions. And this is what the energy is stored in that's going to help us reattach the phosphate onto ADP. And this takes place again in the mitochondria. So once we've got our NADH and FADH2 molecules, we can now go on to the last stage of the process, which is like the electron transport chain. So in the electron transport chain, the electrons and the hydrogen ions are broken off these two compounds here, and they're used to create a pressure gradient. So this is all happening inside of here, and what happens is that the pressure and the hydrogen ions and the electrons get passed along inside this compound, and they're pushed in and out of this little cell, and the pushing generates pressure, a pressure gradient. And in order for them to be pushed along And for this process to happen, we need oxygen. So that's ultimately why we need to breathe, because if we didn't breathe, we wouldn't be able to have this process. Okay, so we've pushed the hydrogen molecules out of the mitochondria and we've created pressure. And ultimately, at the end of the electron transport chain, we force them back in. And the pressure we generate by forcing them back in makes a reaction happen. It catalyzes a reaction. And this pressure and this reaction that comes from it prompts this enzyme here, enzyme ATP synthase, it's called, to make the phosphate join back onto the end of the ADP. So this happens in the mitochondria and its surrounding membrane, and as a result of that, ATP is resynthesized. So we've got hydrogen hanging around, here it is here, and we've got oxygen hanging around. We need to get rid of that. So we combine the two together and we form water. So we breathe that out, or we excrete it out to be polite, or we sweat it out. So ultimately, when we eat our food, when we eat our macronutrients, we are breaking it down, and the breaking down of those macronutrients, all that it's doing and all we want to do is to make this happen. We want to create some energy which is going to make this enzyme, ATP synthase, join the phosphate molecule back onto ADP, and then we resynthesize ATP. And then when we want the energy, we break the phosphate bond off, and then the whole system starts all over again. And homeostasis is maintained in the body.